It is a great pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Rhoda Bernard, and I'm the founding managing director of the Berkeley Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 Able Assembly Arts Better the Lives of Everyone conference. As many of you know, this conference originated in 2013 at Boston Conservatory. It was then known as the Teaching Music to Students on the Autism Spectrum Conference. We started off that year with about 50 people all in one room for a two-day event with a narrower focus. Every year our audience grew and this little conference overflowed its home just a few years later. The 2016 merger between Boston Conservatory and Berklee College of Music made it possible for us to create the Berkeley Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs, which expanded all of our work beyond autism to other populations and beyond music to other art forms. It also made it possible for us to rename this conference the Able Assembly Arts Better the Lives of Everyone to expand its focus as well. Since then, the annual Able Assembly has hosted in the neighborhood of 200 people every year at a three-day in-person event in April. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we reimagined the 2020 Able Assembly in an online format last October. During the day-ending synthesis sessions last fall, several attendees remarked that they wished for more opportunities to engage around intersectionality and what this means for our field. We took that as our charge and set intersectionality, disability, and arts education as the theme for this year's Able Assembly Conference. We received over 70 outstanding session proposals, and the committee has curated an exceptional program for you this weekend. The Berkeley Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs is a catalyst for the inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of visual and performing arts education. We firmly believe that the arts better the lives of everyone. Our work takes place in three areas: arts education programs for people with disabilities, including 10 music programs, 2 adaptive dance programs, and 2 theater programs. These programs serve about 250 families every week, in person in non-COVID times, and now continuing fully remotely. First of their kind graduate programs in music education and autism, including a master's degree and a graduate certificate designed for working teachers with summer and evening classes and remote instructional options, and professional development for the field, including our flagship offering, which is this conference, as well as teacher study groups, workshops, consultations, research projects, an online resource center, a leadership network that engages leaders in the field, and much, much more. You can learn all about our work at berkeley.edu/BIAESN. Before I introduce today's keynote speaker, a few words of thanks. I'd like to thank Dean Darla Hanley, Chair Cecil Adderley, and my many Berkeley colleagues for their support. I'd like to thank our producing partners, Creative Generation, for sharing our vision for this conference and making it a reality. And I'd like to single out 2 members of my team: Daniel Martinez Del Campo for creating and updating the conference website, and Oriana Inferreira for managing our phenomenal social media. And lastly, but definitely not least, I want to thank all of you, presenters, attendees, committee members, for being with us and creating this community together. One other announcement. As all of you know, for the first time, in addition to this weekend's conference sessions, we are launching a brand new digital learning series that begins next month and will unfold over 12 months. I am proud to announce that our first session, Join Our iPad Band, will be led by Adam Goldberg and Pete Sparks, who met last October at the Able Assembly Conference online. This session will take place on Saturday, May 1st at 12 noon Eastern Time. Soon, all of you will receive some pre-session materials by email to prepare you for the May 1st event. We hope that you will join us for this unique opportunity to learn about how to use iPads to make music making accessible for all students from 2 giants in the field. Watch your email for those materials and for the announcements of the additional digital learning sessions. Today, it is my honor to introduce a dear collaborator, colleague, supporter, and friend, Emelyne Bingham. Lynn and I met several years ago when I first learned about her work at Vanderbilt University. We came to find out that we were kindred spirits, whether it had to do with our academic lives, our musical lives, or our mutual love for craft beer, particularly IPAs. Lynn is a member of the advisory board for the Berklee Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs and a big supporter of our work. Emelyne Bingham is an American conductor, speaker, and autism self-advocate. She has led concerts of the Nashville Symphony as its assistant conductor and the Columbus Women's Orchestra as its music director, as well as performances of the Toledo Symphony, Buffalo Philharmonic, Nashville Opera, Nashville Ballet, and Ars Nova Huntsville. Recently, she has conducted recordings with the New York City Ballet Orchestra and members of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra and New York Philharmonic. She has served as the artistic director for the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences Outreach Project in partnership with Leonard Bernstein Center and the Nashville Symphony. Currently, she serves as the artistic director of the Young Texas Artists Music Competition and teaches at the Blair School of Music at Vanderbilt University. In 2011, she was named a research member at the esteemed Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, where she assists with research on music and autism. Her numerous performances in the recording, broadcast, and movie studio with colleagues ranging from Larry Gatlin to Sandy Patty to Amy Grant have been broadcast on A&E, MTV, CMT, Public Television, the Naxos American Classics series, and National Public Radio. She is an active member of the Pi Kappa Lambda and the Recording Academy. Please join me in welcoming today's keynote speaker, Emelyne Bingham.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard, for that all too kind introduction. And I am so happy to greet all of you from what is a beautiful but rainy morning here in Music City, Nashville, Tennessee, live from the Blair School of Music, located here on the campus of Vanderbilt University. I'm deeply honored to be invited to keynote here at the Able Assembly. Conceived through the extraordinary vision and dedicated work of its founder, Dr. Rhoda Bernard, this conference brings together into a single space practitioners, pupils, professors, performers, and other visionaries who push the boundaries of arts education for students with special needs. This space is ambitious, it is provocative, it is challenging, and it is infectious. And it is all better because you are here. So I bid you welcome home. Now, as you know, a central theme of this year's conference is the framework of intersectionality. So intersectionality is one of those words that when you hear it for the first time, you might think, oh, okay, it's like the intersection of two things. I've driven for a long time and I know exactly what an intersection is. It's where two streets cross paths, like the intersection of 12th and Holly Streets. No need to look up that, I've got it. Until, of course, when someone asks you, say at a cocktail party or something, so how does the framework of intersectionality apply in your work and in the courses you teach? And you're really thankful that you just happen to have a big mouthful of food, which buys you some time as you're chewing and desperately scanning your brain for answers, and you're thinking to look both ways? And then you realize you have absolutely no clue, but then you notice, thank God, your wine glass is empty, and you sheepishly mumble some kind of excuse and make a beeline for the bartender, and whew, you vow never again to make assumptions about what new words mean, especially when those words are academic. Have you ever done anything like that? Because I certainly have. I mean, intersectionality, how hard could that be? Well, actually, it really isn't hard at all. But the meaning goes a little deeper than just the convergence of two roadways. The term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s in response to a lawsuit filed based on Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And although Title VII was designed to protect marginalized persons, the claims of some groups, most notably those of Black women, have failed to be recognized by the courts. Well, in 1976, 5 Black women brought a Title VII class action lawsuit against General Motors in what author Dolly Chugh calls a stark example of non-intersectional thinking. In this lawsuit, DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors, these 5 black women claimed race and gender discrimination based on the fact that at GM, only white women were considered for front office jobs and only black men were considered for heavy-duty machinery positions. Black women weren't being considered for either type of job. The court ruled that these 5 black women were unable to prove gender discrimination because not all women were discriminated against. Furthermore, they couldn't prove race discrimination either because not all black people face discrimination. Because the laws weren't intersectional, black women slid through the cracks. Armed with this information, it is now relatively easy for us to keep track of a 2x2 matrix, such as one involving 2 factors like race and gender. But what happens when we insert a third identity variable, such as disability, or a fourth, such as socioeconomic status, or a 5th, or 11th, or 27th? Our original 2-dimensional model quickly becomes multi-dimensional model with an infinite number of possible intersections. And to complicate matters further, suppose some of those intersections are invisible, such as those involving an invisible disability. The question becomes, how then do we make sure that our teaching spaces, complete with countless constellations of such intersections, how do we make sure that our teaching spaces are such tightly sealed places so that there are no cracks for anyone to fall through? Well, I don't know about you, but I've fallen through some cracks. Not so much in the legal sense, but certainly in the educational sense. My disability is hidden. Well, mostly. And it's mostly hidden because I subconsciously learned early on that life was a whole lot easier if I hid it, even though doing so really took a toll on me. Those of you that have heard me speak before know that I liken this process to that of using an invisibility cloak, just like what Harry Potter did. I used this cloak to try to hide my disability and maybe some other things I don't like about myself. You know, it becomes kind of like the glove box in your car. You just kind of add stuff to the mess already in there. The problem for me, though, is that my cloak is heavy. It is oppressive, and it is exhausting. And I'm guessing that most of you use an invisibility cloak, too. Some years ago, after my mother passed away, I had this monumental task of cleaning out her house. And while working in the attic one day, I found a curious-looking, unmarked box tucked way under the eaves. Little did I know then how much that simple box would change my life. Inside, I found a myriad of documents, letters from my doctors and my teachers, school records, notes my mom took during phone calls with school administrators, and the like. I felt as though the ghost of Christmas past had paid me a visit through this simple box, opening a window to parts of my life I had both forgotten and also never known. It was through the evidence in this box that I received a formal diagnosis of autism and began to understand its impact in shaping my life. Autism, as you know, is a developmental disorder marked by communicative and social impairments, as well as intense interests and repetitive behaviors. Today, the Center for Disease Control reports that 1 in 54 persons is diagnosed with autism. But in the 1960s, when I was a small child, no one had ever really heard of autism. In fact, autism didn't even appear in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for another 2 decades. My most salient early memories were all about music. My stay-at-home mom loved the piano and practiced it incessantly. For hours and hours, I watched and listened and danced freely around the room as she played. Later, I would learn that my experiences were greatly enhanced by something called synesthesia. But all I knew at the time was that the deep blues and scarlets and violets swirling around in my head as I moved and swung about were the most magical sensations I had ever known. For hours, I too would sit at the piano and do nothing but improvise. I loved feeling the creativity surge through my veins as I spun rhythms and melodies and chord progressions out of my brain into my fingers. Life was amazing, I remembered thinking, until I went to a place called school, where the social stressors and rigid instructional methods began to cause me to shut down. I felt myself starting to wilt. I felt as if I were a caged animal dying inside one little piece at a time, a process that would continue throughout my academic years. How could it be that half of my teachers thought I was a genius and the other half thought I was, in their words, retarded? Why at age 5 would they bounce me through 5 different classrooms ranging from lower kindergarten to an accelerated 3rd grade class? How could a child, potty trained at 11 months, reading books and playing excerpts of Beethoven piano sonatas by ear before the age of 3, become such a failure in school? How could someone who could identify the model and year of a Volkswagen simply by listening to the sound of the engine not know she was the target of the school bully? And yes, if the Jimmy Kimmel Show had been around at that time, I would have been a likely guest. But these were the 1960s, and conformity, not exception, was the hallmark of social capital. My own disability was hidden away from everyone, even me. As a child, I had always been fascinated by orchestral music, and especially the big double bass. I used to watch Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops on public television on Saturday evenings, if I could get the rabbit ears adjusted just right, and I would wait for the camera to pan over to the bass section. Because I had absolute pitch, I learned how the bass was tuned and how the fingering system would work, even though I had never had the opportunity to see one in real life. Fast forward to one day while walking past the music building as an undergrad, upset because I had failed yet another physics exam and was therefore contemplating my fate, I heard the faint strains of an orchestra sort of wafting through the air. It was a beautiful day and the windows of the music building were open, so I stopped to listen for a good hour or so. After the rehearsal was over, though, the conductor, who had seen me hanging around outside the window, motioned for me to come inside. The next thing I knew, I had a bass in my hand, a plan for lessons, and a small scholarship. The old line from the movie The Sound of Music, "When the Lord closes a door, somewhere he opens a window," rang especially true for me that day because learning to play the bass was a real Hail Mary pass as I was seriously flunking out of engineering school. But I practiced hard and landed my first job in a regional orchestra only 5 months later. In graduate school, I became interested in conducting, probably from being bored from counting measures rest. And I was fortunate years later to have landed a number of conducting positions and a teaching job at a really wonderful university. I am so fortunate. I know that my autism offers me a cognitive style that offers opportunities to do so many things, including becoming a late-in-life hockey player. It's true, I actually won my very first trophy, the Coach's Award, a couple of years ago while at a hockey camp in Canada. It was my very first trophy in anything ever, and as the kid who was often chosen last for kickball in the neighborhood games, I consider this to be a major accomplishment, even though trophies really aren't a thing for my generation. Regardless, I know that not everyone with autism is quite so lucky, and that I am the exception rather than the rule. I was constantly surrounded by friends and teachers who helped me sew my invisibility cloak by teaching me things like how to look people in the eye, how to introduce myself when meeting someone, and a little bit about how our social systems tend to work. And I know my story so far sounds pretty great in many ways, but behind the scenes were many struggles and failures caused by the social disability part of autism. Persons with autism are at a natural disadvantage in our social capitalistic society, where emotional responses to things like personality, communication style, and likability often eclipse seemingly logical things like competence, honesty, and performance. Additionally, missing social cues can result in a disastrous or even dangerous results for a person with autism, particularly with regard to trust. How could I have trusted a friend to help me lose thousands of dollars? Why is it that despite my best intentions, I can never really negotiate a decent contract or salary for myself? Why do my strengths and my gifts still to this day make me a target for bullies? I know now that it's because neurotypical privilege, it does indeed exist. Neurotypical privilege crosses all boundaries of race, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic status. It is pervasive, it is unchecked, and sadly, it is even rewarded in our culture. Now, a common question I get, particularly from parents of children with autism, is about how to manage sensory issues. You see, people with autism often find dealing with sensory information challenging. We tend to be either hyper or hyposensitive to sensory stimuli. In other words, we may be sensory avoidant to some types and sensory seeking of others. I myself am hypersensitive to sounds and smells and hyposensitive to visual stimuli. Often we will seek particular types of sensory stimuli to self-soothe. For instance, when I am super stressed, I like to go to the mall. I don't buy anything per se, but something about all of the lights and the colors and the flurry of activity seems to calm me down. Managing sensitivities is a whole other kettle of fish. And speaking of stress, you know, the nature of my work in normal and not pandemic time requires me to do a fair amount of air travel. And as you can imagine, well, let's just say that the airplane is my own little personal hell. And now I love kids, but a screaming child kicking the back of my seat is bad enough. But when some cologne-saturated person with an hour-old fast food sandwich and fries, you know how awful that smells, right? Well, when that person plops down in the seat next to me, things can unravel pretty quickly for me. Now, a common coping mechanism for many people with autism is to self-stimulate or to stim. People often stim by rocking back and forth, maybe holding one's ears, all the while being unable to speak. All things that kick in for me when I start getting pretty desperate. So here's the thing. You may not know, those things I mentioned, the rocking, the holding the ears, and not speaking, those are all things that raise suspicion in law enforcement officers and also, as I have learned firsthand, also apparently in flight attendants. Sometimes they mistake an inability to speak for non-compliance. So non-compliance is not a good thing, I have learned. And my biggest fear is that all of you will see me on national news someday being taken off the plane in a straitjacket. And as you can imagine, I go to great lengths to try to minimize my sensory surprises. Now, there's a particular airline that I like to fly, in part because they allow me to pre-board and choose the best possible seat to accommodate my sensory issues. Not long ago, after scanning my boarding pass and starting down the jetway, I heard a comment from a nearby passenger, which I'm sure completely meant for me to overhear, something to the effect of, "She sure moves fast for someone with a disability." Now, this isn't the first time I've heard such a passive-aggressive comment, and in the past I've always been like, oh my, you know, this person is right. I'm extremely able-bodied. I mean, I play ice hockey 4 times a week, and I'm in the best shape I've ever been in my life. There are plenty of others worse off than me. I start feeling a little ashamed, so much that I feel like I need to externalize my disability to make it valid, right? And as I head down the jetway, I notice that my subconscious has sort of taken over my body because now I seem to have developed a little limp, and no matter what I do, I can't shake the limp. And I'm like, Lynn, look at yourself. Well, on one particular morning, I was feeling, how shall we say, a little bit crusty. And instead of taking my usual little guilt trip, I whipped my head around, walked over to that passenger, all the while thinking raising my voice was probably not the best decision here. And I said to her, "Ma'am, are you making assumptions about my disability?" Ooh, her eyes got really big and she didn't say anything. And you know, just like an old hound dog with a bone, I just couldn't let it go. I don't know what all I said. It was like a big blur now, but there was a little from a bystander when I was finished. I turned back around towards the gate agent, ready to accept my straitjacket, but instead I was met with a very wide-eyed look and a, "You have a nice day, ma'am." I proudly walked quickly down the jetway, limp-free. Shedding that cloak even for just a moment felt so good. I am certainly not alone in having a hidden disability. In fact, according to the 2002 Census Bureau, of all the people who live with an illness, 96% live with one that is invisible. Furthermore, of those who live with a severe disability, 73% use no assisted devices like a wheelchair or a cane. Invisible disabilities take many forms, including chronic pain, renal or cardiac disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, and learning disabilities, just to name a few. In the end, researchers estimate that approximately 10% of the population have a disability that is considered to be invisible. Examples like my airport encounter and fear of the straitjacket are also not unique. According to the Rudderman Foundation, people with disabilities make up 1/3 to 1/2 of people shot and killed by law enforcement officers. And they are more likely to be victims of crime than people without disabilities. The police often use excessive force against people with disabilities, and people with disabilities are more likely to be killed by the police. The odds increase as race and mental health are taken into consideration. When people with disabilities have a violent encounter with law enforcement, the media are more likely to blame the disability rather than the officer or officers who inflicted harm. Eddie Glaude, chair of African American Studies at Princeton University, speaks of race and social capital in terms of the value gap. He stated, "We talk about the achievement gap, we talk about the empathy gap, we talk about the wealth gap, and the value gap is this: the belief that white people matter more than others. And to the extent to which that belief animates our social arguments, our political practices, our economic realities, under different material conditions, as long as that belief obtains, democracy will always be in abeyance in this country." I'd like to propose, given the gaps named above, the belief is that white, heterosexual, non-disabled males matter more than others. When we devalue people, we feel justified in claiming and abusing our power over them. When they underperform, we feel justified. Now, as you've heard, I'm a conductor, and we conductors use the elements of time and space and energy in our craft. As a matter of fact, I'm a little obsessed with time, space, and energy. So when one of those three things makes the news, you can be sure I'm going to be all over it. Now, I don't know if you were paying attention to this over the summer of 2019 or not, but the co-captain of the U.S. women's soccer team, Megan Rapinoe, sure got a lot of attention because of the way she claimed her space. Now, people claim their space all the time in the pursuit of power. For instance, I'm betting that you found yourself on the plane or maybe in a movie theater where the stranger next to you has firmly claimed the entire armrest. And no matter how much you politely nudge them, they just won't budge. Or maybe they save a seat for someone. Some people claim auditory space. Have you ever been in a restaurant where someone sitting next to you talks and laughs so loudly that you can't carry on a conversation with your party? Ooh, and then there's our cologne-loving friends. And let's not even talk about the kinds of space people claim when they're behind the wheel of a car. All of these things impede someone else's space. And taking away that space rightfully belongs to someone else shows a lack of respect for others. But sometimes, when people claim space that is rightfully theirs, people get upset. So when Megan Rapinoe, after scoring 2 goals to defeat France in the Women's World Cup in 2019, when she stood in the field, feet together, and raised her extended arms in a confident gesture, But she took a lot of flack for that. She was called unbearable and unpatriotic. Others criticized her pink, purple hair and accused her of being arrogant and of thinking of herself as a big warrior. Look at this tweet by English talk show personality Piers Morgan. It received over 16,000 likes and over 21,000 people have been talking about it. Morgan tweeted, "Ms. Rapinoe sure does love herself. Can't wait to see our lionesses dent that stupendous ego." Right? Because seriously, who stands like that and gets away with it? Oh, wait. Yeah, I'm sure that cellist is thinking, he sure does love himself. Can't wait to see our violas dent that stupendous ego. I bet there aren't 21,000 people tweeting about that picture. So what's all the fuss? Perhaps it's because she is a woman, or because she is openly gay, or because we envy her incredible skills and her athleticism. Or perhaps it's because of the intersection of those things means that she has less value. I mean, after all, let's be honest. We don't like it when people we think less of exercise their power. We don't like it when they perform well. We don't like sharing power, especially with those we think less of. Alison Reichelt has an interesting take on Rapinoe's victory pose. She wrote that the dominant set of norms of femininity literally makes women and feminine persons take up less space by urging them to make their bodies small, sit and even stand with knees crossed close together and elbows in, arms crossed over the body or held in close, and so forth. At her suggestion, let's take a quick look at a Google search of women standing. Here they are, in essence, variations of the same thing, lack of space. Limbs drawn in, weight on one leg so they're off balance. Even the one with outstretched arms seems to say, heck if I know. All of these poses communicate weakened social power. Quests for power occur on the institutional level too, and unfortunately our arts organizations and education systems are not immune. You know, music in every other culture in the world is a grassroots phenomenon. It is shared, a community behavior in which there is a fine line between performer and audience member. Music does not exist apart from the people who make it. It is not a commodity that is bought or sold, and there is usually a social justice component. Contrast those qualities with those that exist in our typical Western music organizations. Within the past several years, like classrooms, some arts organizations have attempted to be more inclusive. So, this is really a wonderful thing, and I appreciate the desire for those organizations to embrace inclusion. In performing arts organizations, the attempt is often made through the offering of sensory-friendly performances. Now, sensory-friendly performances, for those of you that don't know, are performances where the sensory information is toned down a little bit, different lighting, not quite as loud, etc. These performances are often marketed to families of children with autism. And families tend to like these because they're around other families of children with autism. And other families may be more sympathetic should a child start to make noise or move around a little bit. Now, this may sound like a pretty good idea at first, but let's be honest about what's really going on here. Why aren't all performances sensory-friendly? I'll tell you why. Because a sensory-friendly performance is designed to serve people who may engage with music in a non-traditional way, in a place where they will not disturb the organization's wealthy patrons. What's really going on here is segregation. The phrase separate but equal comes to mind, and we all know how that experiment turned out. Separate space is not equal space. Separate space is confined space. There's a saying that's been floating around the internet about inclusion that goes something like this. Diversity is being invited to the party. but inclusion is being asked to dance. And while it's easy to see that sensory-friendly performances are basically an invitation to the party, the hard work, as it always is when attempting to achieve full inclusion, is envisioning what being asked to dance really looks like. I believe that every child should be able to visualize themselves on every stage, in every gallery, in every activity, whether it's playing an instrument or acting or conducting or whatever, by seeing someone there with whom they can identify. They need to be able to say, hey, there's someone down there who is just like me. Maybe I can do that too. That, to me, is being asked to dance. Chug sums things up this way. When a law, policy, or way of thinking assumes a single dimension of identity, usually the majority identity, then it is failing to be intersectional. Said more simply, if we only take some people into account in our fight for equality and inclusion, we are not actually fighting for equality and inclusion. The road to freeing up space so that others can rightfully claim theirs requires us to shift our thinking about disability. Using a social model of disability, as opposed to a medical model, allows us to reframe disability in a more helpful way. The medical model promotes disability as a deficit, something that should be fixed. For instance, this is James. James uses a wheelchair. Since James cannot climb the stairs, we must fix James so that he is no longer disabled. Instead, the social model posits that a disability is a normal human variation, like hair color or eye color, rather than a deficit. In this model, it's the stairs that are disabling James. This is James. James uses a wheelchair. We can make it easier for James to get where he wants to go. The social model allows space for James, well, to be James. So how can we revisit our teaching practices with the framework of intersectionality so that all of our students can rightly and justly claim their spaces? I believe it involves a dynamic process using inventory and assessment through inquiry. These skills you probably already have, and you probably use them every day. But I ask you to consider applying your skills in this way. First of all, I invite you to take inventory of your space. Start with your physical space. Is it accessible for all of your students despite their intersections? Is it inviting? Is there something like a photo or an object with which any student may be able to identify so that it feels comfortable? Does your space inspire intellectual and artistic curiosity? The second thing is to get to know your students. This may seem like a simple thing, but it really rings true. Listen. Listen to what they tell you. Where do they self-identify? What other intersections might you observe through interactions with caregivers or behaviors outside of your classroom? What other intersections might be emerging through behavioral changes you observe? Next, take inventory of the constellations of intersections in your classes. Which sets of intersections dominate your teaching space? Perhaps you may have predominantly white females of remarkable ability that dominate the social, musical, and learning spaces. What constellations make up the spaces that are being absorbed, or hidden, or excluded? Take inventory of your teaching practices. How does the division and allocation of constellation space inform and shape your teaching practices? Are there spaces that are compromised or excluded? Do your students trust you to make sure that they are included and valued? Lastly, I urge you to consider adopting the philosophy of universal design. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of universal design, but I think it's worth revisiting here. Universal design is a philosophy that originated in the field of architecture, and it's really quite simple. Let's apply it to designing the entrance of a building. Instead of creating multiple entrances, each for a different purpose, the approach in universal design is to create one entrance that is equally accessible for everyone. A single door approach automatic opener combination, wide enough to accommodate someone in a wheelchair, someone making a delivery of goods, someone pushing a stroller, even a skateboarder is possible. Universal design applied to learning assumes a similar approach. One lecture, one activity, one assessment accessible to everyone. I mean, wouldn't that be easier for you? Wouldn't you be a happier teacher? Wouldn't you find more joy in what you do? And more importantly, wouldn't that increase the level of social bonding in your class? Could it lead to a more compassionate environment for all the students? But here's the thing, we really can't create or manage space for others until we look carefully at our own intersections and the biases they may foster. Which intersections are we hiding under our cloaks? What things don't we want others to see about us? But like stuff crammed into the glove box, there's some important stuff under there. We have to ask ourselves what good or even amazing things are we hiding about ourselves in the process. Our journey begins with an honest assessment of our own privilege. I'd like to close with a short personal story about recognizing my own privilege. When I was a young child, my family lived in a lower middle class suburb of Chicago. One day when my dad had had enough of sitting in rush hour traffic, he came home and unfolded one of those big travel maps that was pleated like a giant accordion. He stuck it on the wall and tossed a dart at it. Within a matter of weeks, we were living right where the dart had landed, smack dab in the middle of a rural and poor area of Tennessee. My new school was a marked change from the well-staffed and highly resourced school I attended in Chicago. My new school, I had no special education teachers, so there was a handful of teenagers in my third grade class, all with needs now that I realize went unaddressed. In fact, years later, I learned that some of my classrooms had no running water in their homes. Now, I had only been there for a couple of weeks when it was time for the annual holiday gift exchange. When the designated elf handed me my present and I pulled back the already wrinkled wrapping paper, I discovered, to my surprise, a pair of yellow knee socks. Now, I don't know how you would have taken this when you were 8 years old, but I was not at all thrilled about my gift. I had hoped for something cool, like the Hot Wheels car I gave one of the teenage boys whose name I drew. I remember thinking to myself, who in the hell would give a kid a pair of socks in a school gift exchange? And in a rare moment of restraint, instead of opening my mouth and saying something my mother would have regretted, I looked up to see what the other kids got. I was shocked. They too got socks, or hats, or mittens, or gloves, or anything that would make the long winter walks home a little more bearable. And that wrinkled wrapping paper on my gift, I realized that it had been reused. Someone had taken great care to make my present look appealing. My hair, as my students would say now, had been blown back. I now refer to those awareness-jolting, perception-altering, attitude-shifting experiences as yellow sock moments. Now, I know that if we're going to be agents of change, we must be open to and willing to embrace yellow socks moments, because it is our privilege that prevents us from creating space for others. I hope you will join me in shedding your old, worn invisibility cloaks, and when you do, you just might find yourself wearing yellow socks. Thank you.